Now, something happens when you read the Bible a few times. It starts to take different shapes. It's not an easy read. It's long and drawn out and sometimes feels a bit overwhelming. Sometimes it's just a great read if you're trying to fall asleep. But many people think of it as a single book, or maybe even two books, for example, the Old and the New Testament. In fact, we're taught that the Old Testament, well, that was before Jesus, and the New Testament, well, that's the new revelation that recounts the life and ministry of Jesus. Well, that's certainly one way to look at it, and it's true, but something interesting happens when you study it a little more intently. Certain patterns emerge that make you look at it differently. And I don't mean necessarily in a bad way or a good way, but just through new eyes. You see, the Bible is in fact an anthology consisting of separate books with separate authors aimed at different audiences, written with different intentions. And what you receive as the Bible, if you're a Christian, changes depending on the denomination you follow. For example, the Protestant Old Testament has 39 books, Roman Catholic 46 books, and Eastern Orthodox has 49 books. And then if we look to the Oriental Orthodox Church, well, they count them in a completely different way. But today I want to talk to you about something many people don't usually pick up on unless it's shown to them, and that is the idea of scriptural typology. See, many Christians are taught and believe that the Bible was dictated by the Holy Spirit and therefore inerrant, or that fundamentally every word is inspired. Well, that might be true. However, the New Testament was written, translated, and redacted by men, and it certainly has discernible patterns, including passages that can contradict other passages. Now, scholars are in general agreement that Mark is in fact the first gospel written, and this would have been in about AD 70. Now, Mark never actually met Jesus, and it's generally thought that he was a companion of the Apostle Peter. Even more interesting, when we look at Matthew and Luke, academics are pretty sure they used the Gospel of Mark to craft their Gospels based on how the parables and the stories are structured. Scholars also believe they had another source that is commonly referred to as Q, though this actual source has never been found. John's Gospel is quite a bit different than the other three, and it's likely that his was written last, sometime around AD 90 to 100. But today, I'm going to focus on the most widely referenced gospel, and that is the Gospel of Matthew. Now, Matthew was writing for a largely Jewish base, so when he crafted his gospel, he did so in a way that would appeal to people who were familiar and likely observed Jewish law, but were interested in the new message of Jesus. But the way he did this was with a strong typological association with the books most people in his audience were already familiar with. And that, of course, was the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Pentateuch. Let me show you what I mean. So let's take a story that is very familiar and dear to the Jews of antiquity as well as most of us today, and that is the story of the Exodus. Now, the story of Exodus represents the liberation of the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. You'll remember that Moses did all of these signs in front of Pharaoh, and after the final plague, Pharaoh finally let them leave. Matthew's gospel also places Jesus and his family in Egypt out of fear of an impending slaughter ordered by Herod, who sought to kill the infant Jesus by murdering the male children in and around Bethlehem. Matthew is the only gospel that places Jesus in Egypt. Then Matthew continues framing Jesus' early life as a deliberate replaying of Israel's story. Just as Israel, or the Jews, are brought out of Egypt in Exodus to become God's covenant people, Joseph, Mary, and the child Jesus also come out of Egypt. To continue the typological connection, water becomes the boundary between slavery and new life. Israel passes through the waters of the Red Sea, and God opens up a way where there was no way, and after Pharaoh reverses course on his earlier decision. The sea then closes back over his forces, signaling the defeat of the old oppressor and the end of Israel's bondage. Likewise, Jesus is shown passing through the waters of baptism, not because he needed cleansing or from sins, but to mark the inauguration of a new exodus. He steps into the waters as Israel's representative, and he emerges to begin his mission of liberation. The parallel, of course, isn't that the scenes are identical, but that both crossings proclaim the same theology. God delivers his people through water, and what once held them captive is decisively left behind. Now, continuing the typology, the wilderness becomes the place where Israel's identity is tested and formed. After passing through the Red Sea, the Israelites enter the desert for 40 years, where hunger, fear, and impatience expose what is really in their hearts. There, God sustains them with manna, which is like bread from heaven, teaching them dependence and trust rather than control. Likewise, after Jesus passes through the waters of baptism, he's driven into the wilderness, again, 40 days, where the devil's temptations focus on the same pressure points. Hunger, remember when he said, turn these stones to bread, as well as power, self-justification. In Matthew's framing, Jesus is not simply enduring hardship, he's reliving Israel's desert trial as Israel's faithful representative, responding with obedience where Israel often grumbled and complained, so that a renewed people can be led not by appetite or fear, but by fidelity to God. Lastly, in Exodus, we see Moses ascend the mountain to receive God's law, and Israel is shaped into a covenant people through the 10 Commandments. Matthew then presents Jesus in a strikingly parallel posture. Jesus goes up on a mountain and teaches with authority in what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And this begins with the Beatitudes. Typologically, the scene signals that Jesus is not merely commenting on Moses, but speaking at one who brings the law into its intended depth. The Beatitudes are not a simple replacement of the 10 Commandments, so much as a portrait of the kind of person the covenant is meant to produce. For me, once you see it, you can't really unsee it. No matter how you approach biblical texts, these parallels seem to function like a kind of codified literary theological pattern. If this is new to you, or perhaps you see something else, please let me know. And of course, if you like this type of content, please subscribe.